Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us here this afternoon. This is the second of our debates as part of a series on encouraging serious conversations about serious issues in which we encourage people to disagree, but to disagree without being disagreeable. We've heard from Kevin Walsh that Justice Marshall was known for that characteristic, that ability to disagree without being disagreeable. And it's something that we think is particularly important in law school. Lawyers are trained in the art of disagreement. We do a lot of that, but we are also trained in the techniques of civility and reasoned disputation. So this is completely consistent with who we are, and we're really delighted to be hosting this debate this afternoon. Our disputants have been warned to maintain civility. I think we're going to be okay in that regard. But we have a moderator just in case things were to get out of control. So let me turn things over to our moderator, Professor Jack Price.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jack Price. As Dean Perdue said, it's great to be here. And although I am a moderator, I will attempt to be immoderate in some instances, maybe to goad their passions a bit. We'll see how it goes. So as you know, this is a civil discourse debate, right? We try to be civil. What's the discourse on, however? The discourse is on a particular proposition. Today, the proposition that we will debate is as follows. Freedom of speech is dying on the American college campus. Okay? Freedom of speech is dying on the American college campus. Arguing in favor of this, we have Professors Kevin Walsh and Professors Kurt Lash. The other people here, I guess we could call them defenders of speech codes. Maybe not. We'll let them explain. Professor Judd Campbell, Professor Hank Chambers. So how does this work? There is one vote that we'll take here in just a minute at the beginning. You express your agreement or disagreement with that proposition. Again, freedom of speech is dying on the American college campus. After you vote at the beginning, we're going to debate this, 45 minutes or so, and then we'll ask you to vote again. We will not tell you the results of the original vote until the end. At the end, we will look at both votes, and we will see if the arguments up here moved the needle any one direction or the other. And that's how we'll measure who the winners are. All right, in a second, we're going to do the voting. I think that should be coming up briefly. And I'll mention one last thing before we get started. We are taping this for posterity's sake. So you are free to say anything you want. It's a free speech debate, but we're taping it, just so you know. All right, ready for voting?
Okay, so on your device, go to pollev.com/law AV, and you should see this question. Just select the one that you feel represents your opinion.
We vote?
You can also text law AV to 22333 if you just have an old school phone. If anyone's having trouble, raise your hand up.
We've got 40 results so far. Keep voting, please.
You can change your vote if you hit the wrong button. Once you lock in, that's it.
Well, I didn't know undecided was a game.
While the voting continues, I'll mention a little bit more about the programming. We'll start with 90-second introductions or opening statements by each side, actually by all four. We'll flip back and forth. Then I'll have about 15 minutes to pose some of my own questions to the disputants, and then the rest of the room will have plenty of time to pose their own questions. We're getting pretty close.
Close the voting in 10 seconds.
So 10 more seconds, and we will keep your vote secret until the end. We're about up. We got 2 more votes out of that. That was worth it. All right, all closed. All closed. All right, the first will be Professor Kurt Lash here. He's going to argue in favor of this motion, or in favor of the proposition. Go ahead, Kurt.
All right, thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm going to make a short opening statement, and then we're going to go to the tape. Okay. The First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution protect our freedom of expression, the right to speak and be heard, to hear and to discuss. To suppress this right is to suppress the proper functioning of democracy itself. And in the past, colleges and universities have promoted and protected the ideal of free expression and the robust and uninhibited exchange of ideas. Over the last few years, however, freedom of speech has come under attack at the very institutions we once counted on to guard this essential human right. Unless this trend is reversed, my partner and I believe that the ideal will die. Go ahead.
Overnight, mayhem on campus. The University of California broadly erupting in flames as over 1,000 came out to protest an appearance by the self-described right-wing internet troll Milo Yiannopoulos.
We will not tolerate racism or sexism or hate crimes and violence. He's a fascist and Berlin did not welcome him.
At least 6 people were injured, including this Trump supporter and his pepper spray.
That concludes my opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Professor Lash. Professor Campbell.
Thanks. Free speech on campus isn't dying. It may have a small cold, but it just needs to binge watch Netflix for a while. There are about 20 million college students and about 2 million faculty and administrators in the United States. Occasionally, some of these people act in illiberal ways. But free speech abounds on college campuses, and ideas don't die unless people stop caring about them. Now, to be sure, there are advocates for restrictions of speech, but here's the thing. We are all advocates for restrictions of speech, and for very good reason. Free speech does not and cannot mean entirely unrestricted speech free of social and administrative consequences. Plagiarism and sexual harassment policies restrict speech. Indeed, nearly every aspect of an education either compels or restricts speech in some way. So the crucial question to be answered with care is how far to restrict speech. Supporting reasonable limits on speech doesn't make you an opponent of free speech any more than supporting basic consumer protection law makes you a Marxist. Sometimes we disagree about what free speech entails, but that just shows that free speech is very much alive.
Thank you very much. Professor Walsh.
I want to begin with a correction of our position. We are not in favor, of free speech dying on American college campuses. We are claiming that it is, which is an empirical claim. It's a description borne out by the video evidence. I don't think we'll hear that what you saw shutting down the speech were, in fact, reasonable restrictions. Those things are happening. It's tempting to think that that's just, couldn't happen here. Well, if it could happen down the road at William & Mary Law School, When the executive director of the ACLU that is there for a free speech discussion, it can happen here. It can happen anywhere. But the thing is our case doesn't rest just on these vividly depicted, these videos, okay? Because the real threat is the one that's inside. Free speech dies from the inside, from fear of what others will think, from fear of giving offense, from a worry about the ideas that other peoples are expressing. So we have three claims that support this dynamic. Number one, people are increasingly willing to impose costs on the expression of unpopular views. That might be shutting it down, it might be shaming, it might be saying it's offensive. Secondly, even if those people are only a minority, they can affect the climate on campus. And third, that effect is not spread equally.
Thank you, Professor Walsh. I'm going to grab the microphone and work from the side. I'm assuming everyone's comfortable speaking from their seats, but if anyone wants to walk through the room like Oprah, they're free to do so. Just come grab the microphone from me. All right, the first question. Oh, my goodness, Hank.
Just trying to limit a brother's free speech.
There are some speech codes I have not yet informed everyone of. Hank, go ahead.
Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon for today's civil discourse discussion. The resolution states freedom of speech is dying on the American college campus. Professor Campbell and I are in the negative. The resolution is incorrect from both a narrow legal perspective and more broadly from a philosophical perspective. Now, surely speech on the American college campus may be getting more raucous, and speakers may be getting challenged more often than they have been in the past, with the result that some outside speakers may feel more discomfort on college campuses than they have in the past. However, freedom of speech is not dying on the American college campus. Indeed, it's not even close. When free speech and campus speakers are discussed, the issue is framed often as either allowing controversial speakers to speak on campus or preventing controversial speakers from speaking on campus. The former is considered consistent with academic values, and the latter is considered inconsistent with academic values. However, a university's mission is to foster the robust and free exchange of ideas in service of discovering truth and advancing knowledge. In service of discovering truth and advancing knowledge. So 2 questions I hope we discuss today are these. What kind of speech facilitates a university's academic values, and under what circumstances does a speaker's speech do so? Rather than thinking of disputes regarding campus speakers as battles in campus censorship, the issue is better thought of as being thought of through the lens of curation and economics, which I'm sure we will talk about during the conversation today.
Thank you very much, Hank. All right, the first question is for the proponents of the proposition over there, for Kevin Walsh and Kurt Lash. You guys will have a bit of time to respond. It'll be my discretion here in deciding how much time to give you. I'm just going to keep things moving. Don't want to cut anyone off. Then I'll ask for any rebuttal from this side as well. So the question's for them, but you can feel free to respond in a moment. So the question is, either of you may respond, is, yes, to an extent, there is lots of free speech on campus right now and some restrictions on speech. So in one sense, this is an empirical question, how much is free and how much is not. But there's a normative question at bottom, which is, what is free speech, right? Do you agree there should be some limitations? So I ask you on the normative question, what type of speech should be allowed, and how would you tell the difference between what should be allowed and what should not be allowed?
Something I'd like to say immediately for those of you who want to investigate further, heterodoxacademy.org contains a number of studies just since 2017. Google "The Skeptics Are Wrong," Part 1 and Part 2, and you'll get into the information. Okay. In terms of the speech that should be protected, I think the court has long understood that Speech is presumptively protected. You don't have to prove in. And here I'd have to disagree with Professor Chambers. We should not be discussing what speech actually furthers particular goals as decided by an administration or by a majority. Speech is presumptively protected unless somehow it transgresses against some type of unacceptable norm, which traditionally have been things like obscenity, child pornography, speech which targets a terroristic threat, fighting words, things along those lines. Other than those specifically identified and excluded categories from freedom of speech, the court takes a position that democracy requires speech to be wide open, robust, and uninhibited for democracy to work. That, I think, should be the test.
Hank, go ahead and respond.
Sure, and that certainly gets at the question of what speech is. It doesn't get at what the question of what free is. Right? There's no doubt in my mind that there's lots of stuff that's speech. The question, though, is how do you regulate it in terms of time and place? I think it's fair to say that for right now, presumably, I have the floor. The fact that folks could stand up, any of you could stand up and start yelling at me, even in a perfectly reasonable fashion, doesn't mean that what you're going to do qualifies as the kind of free speech that we should allow. At the end of the day, the question is, what is the university's purpose and what speech furthers its purpose, assuming its purpose is, in fact, discovering truth and advancing knowledge?
And I'll just add one thing to that, which is the way we answer those questions is not going to be necessarily the same way we ask questions and answer them with respect to governmental authority to regulate private actors. So the way we define what the limits of free speech should be within a campus community are not necessarily the same limits that ought to constrain governmental authority outside of campus.
I completely agree with that. Speech on campus should be freer.
And there's also, it's not just about rules, it's about norms and expectations and what you approach things with. And so if students are afraid of giving their viewpoint when we're discussing something in a class, that is a problem for precisely the search for truth and the robust exchange of ideas. And so one thing we know is wrong is trying to shut other people down because you're worried that that speech might persuade or somehow have some attraction.
I think that's right, but part of the problem here is that the internal constraints that Kevin's talking about, which are very much real and very much important to deal with, are fueled by a narrative that freedom of speech is dying on American college campuses. The way we talk about this debate affects the degree of free speech we have on college campuses. The narrative itself becomes self-fulfilling.
In terms of the narrative, once again, that becomes an empirical question, which again is going to be beyond our ability to really dig into the numbers, which is why I would once again encourage you to go to the particular website, heterodoxacademy.org. We're dealing with the Knight Foundation Gallup surveys of 3,000 current college students, Cato YouGov survey, 2,300 students, Heterodox Academy surveys of 1,078 students, FIRE data also along with Heterodox Academy. We're talking about thousands of current students, which establishes, among other things, that students agree, regardless of your ideological position, that the climate on campus, as they perceive it now, prevents some people from saying things they believe because others might find them offensive. There are more findings than that.
Let me jump in here with a question directed first here, but I'm sure there'll be plenty more discussion. So, freedom of speech, one might put the argument this way, is freedom of speech really only exists if if the people who are subject to potential restrictions feel that there's almost no restrictions whatsoever. There's a couple far fringe points of view, right? We know we can't incite a riot. We know there's a couple other things we can't say. Defamation is a common one. Speech codes, though, on campus tend to be more restrictive than that. And once they're more restrictive than that, isn't it the case that there is a sense of which there is not actual freedom, because it is always freedom to speak as long as the administration is okay with it? And if those rules are clear and transparent, maybe we could live with them. But they're not necessarily clear and transparent. Often speech codes on campus are phrased in terms of harassing or demeaning behavior or actions. And so, in a sense, even though free speech is generally available, there are codes which, ambiguous enough, inhibit the actual exercise of speech.
There's an irony with that. That is, speech that harasses or demeans may be exactly the kind of speech that Kevin and Kurt believe will stop people from saying things. So if by free speech you mean you can say anything you want, but we then have to be worried that folks might be discouraged from speaking because they may be called to account for it, then we're in a very difficult loop. Presumably what we're talking about in terms of speech codes is that we want to make sure that the speech code is there in order, and just recognize I'm not a big fan of speech codes, but it's there in order to make sure that there is free and robust exchange of information that will allow us to discover truth and advance knowledge. If language is not doing that, if the speech is not doing that, then it's not serving the purpose that speech is supposed to serve on a university campus.
Since we're talking about the particular goals and the purposes of speech on campus, I'd like to address that in particular. I agree with Professor Campbell. Colleges and universities exist to transmit and to advance human knowledge. I think this can and must be done in an environment of physical safety with mutual regard and respect. But knowledge cannot advance without challenging existing assumptions, and knowledge cannot be transmitted without exposing gaps in our current understanding. None of this can take place in an environment where perceived insults or offense become the standard for acceptable discussion or debate. It's simply not likely that any true advance in knowledge or liberty took place without offending a substantial portion of the population along the way.
And I would just add that, well, how to put it, free speech is oftentimes for losers, okay? Free speech is for people who are challenging a dominant consensus, okay? So if you look at the changing dynamics of free speech on campuses, okay, in the 60s, it was a challenge now against dominant social attitudes on racial matters, sexual matters, and related and sort of other things. But they were the losers in society at large. Now you're hearing free speech be viewed as, you know, the conservative losers, okay? The ones who have unpopular views, say about marriage or about sexuality. Okay? And so, you know, there is a sense in which free speech is for losers so that you can kind of maybe one day say there's something more to this.
And I think this touches on sort of a broader point about the trajectory of the debate, which is what we're talking about here is freedom of speech on campus. The broader context is great degree of social division, not just political but cultural. We're in a moment of cultural transition. We're in a moment of deep, deep political tension, and that puts a lot of pressure on the campus climate. That's not to say that pressure doesn't manifest itself in ways that are certainly violative of what I would consider to be free speech. The point is, when we're asking whether free speech is dying, whether as a value free speech is no longer recognized and put faith in, I think we have to recognize that there are other things that are happening outside of the context of free speech that are really making that sort of a flashpoint in a way where values in free speech are not as contested today.
All right, another question then, this one for Professors Walsh and Lash. Both of you are law professors. Both of you want to teach students. You want to help them become better and smarter and more talented and able to understand their world. And as part of that mission, you very tightly control your classroom environment. You actually take points off for speech that is incoherent on the final exam. They must say things that comport with realities. Not to say you would take a point of view, you would say if they are not correct in their statement of law, these students will not get good grades. The point being is to achieve an educational objective, it becomes necessary to structure the discourse. You have a syllabus that's limited in certain important respects. Why can't a university, just as a teacher inside a classroom, structure discourse to achieve certain pedagogical ends?
Well, I think that's what's going on in all these circumstances where you have the disruptions. right? This is a highly stylized thing. The fact that we talk right now and you listen, the fact that even though I have a mic, I didn't interrupt Professor Chambers, although I was tempted to, and he's got tenure, right? So, you know, and so do I, right? This is, I mean, we have protections in place and we do structure things. It's the willingness to transgress those norms that is increasing. So if you look at the number of substantial event disruptions where the heckler's veto succeeds, it's going up. Okay, it's still small, but I predict, okay, and I predict it will continue going up. And that's because the norms have shifted. And so in some ways, what you're seeing is more speech. You might say, well, how's it, you know, gosh, that's great. These people, they feel like they can express their views. But when you can hijack one of these platforms and get away with it, things are bad. Free speech is dying there.
And just quickly to follow up on that, in terms of this being controlled communication, I mean, there's free speech in the micro and free speech in the macro. It's true, in my free speech class, there's no free speech, in the sense that I am endeavoring to communicate a body of information and doctrine to the students, and I have to do that in a controlled manner. It puts the students in a position of receptivity, which is awkward. They have to trust my ability, they have to trust my goals and my good faith to bring both sides of the argument to bear in their understanding of freedom of speech doctrine, and hopefully I'm training them to encounter arguments on both sides once they're lawyers. But at the end of the day, it will still be Professor Lash's controlled communication. For us to further our goals as a university devoted to challenging and furthering knowledge, there has to be a diverse number of faculty from a diverse number of perspectives who will present freedom of speech in a little bit different a way than Professor Lash would. We should be celebrating student groups that support and present speakers from a diverse number of positions, whether liberal, libertarian, progressive, whatever it might be. As an institutional commitment to both transmitting and furthering knowledge, we should be committed first as faculty to presenting both sides in our micro capacity. We should be committed to it in our hiring in a diverse capacity and a diverse faculty. And then finally, we should be supporting you wherever possible in your student groups, and you're bringing diverse perspectives to bear, and we should protect you from disruption with anyone who would want to interfere with your right to bring those perspectives to bear to your community.
So I think it's unmistakable that shouting down speakers is the wrong approach. And to the extent that you want to shout down speakers as a form of civil disobedience, you should suffer the consequences just like you do any other form of civil disobedience. But the question goes to a bigger point, which is campuses are different than courts of law where you have regulations of private behavior. So the way First Amendment law has been shaped in the 20th century primarily is by Supreme Court justices who carefully avoid making any value judgments and even have gone so far as to elide any sort of distinction between truth and falsity in First Amendment doctrine. Universities do not have to take that sort of relativist agnosticism about truth and values. We do not have to say that Holocaust deniers have the same sort of status in terms of the value that they contribute to campus debate as anybody else. They do not. That isn't to say that if they show up and somebody invites them, I'm going to shout them down, but it's to say that a student group should not give a Holocaust denier a platform. That is not the value that the university should be sending. The goal of the education is served by having reasonable civil discourse, and that doesn't require just anybody with a crackpot theory showing up to campus and having a platform.
Just if I may quickly respond, I think that is what has just been communicated very much reflects the common approach on college campuses today, and I think it's why freedom of speech is dying. That in fact, we cannot impose a priori rules on what counts as the person who's unreasonable in their speech. And we will not welcome and we will condemn student groups who bring that person who has that particular perspective, which, by the way, if I may say so, is exactly like denying the Holocaust. I don't think it's any different at all because, of course, that's what the Republican Party does, or whatever, the particular thing might be. No. We should be celebrating student groups. The more unreasonable the groups, the better for the diversity of perspective on campus. We have to communicate a body of information. We're controlled and we'll lose tenure, and I accept that if we're not communicating that information. But in terms of your participating in a much broader debate, your willingness to challenge the most fundamental of assumptions that everybody told you were absolutely true, we should be providing you that opportunity, protecting you in that opportunity, and if we think it's unreasonable, we should answer it, not shut it down a priori.
No, that just can't be the case because we just don't have time to do all of those things. Issues that have been determined and decided and that are untrue, quite falsifiably untrue, there's not really much point in coming to a college campus and redebating those issues. If you want to debate them on the street corner, that's one thing. But to bring folks into a college campus in order to have a discussion about issues that have already been decided, which then pushes away discussions that are still alive, that's a problem. And to suggest that we can't make that determination, or at least suggest to those student groups that it's a bad idea to bring folks who are going to bring falsifiable or falsified claims to bear, that's a little problematic just in terms of using our students' time in order to move the university's purposes forward.
I'm going to invite others to ask questions. I had 2 or 3 more, but we have covered my questions backwards and forwards. So if you have a question, please use the microphone and don't be afraid. Go ahead, ask whatever crazy question you have. This is a free speech debate.
Nothing
so.
unreasonable, though.
Oh, perfect.
Nothing.
I'm
Nothing
delighted.
untrue, at least according to them.
And if it's falsifiable, you're out of here.
Well, no, this is actually absolutely true. We are, and this is for Professor Walsh, right
You're
now
biased.
we have, that may be, but I have still been to your house.
You're always welcome.
We actually have, you're talking about losers, right? Winners and losers, and how free speech is, more important to the losers. Well, here's the problem. Right now, we have one party controlling both houses of Congress and the White House, and we have a fairly evenly divided Supreme Court. How can we call the conservatives losers right now?
Which party? There is no party that controls the college campus generically, but which do you think is the dominant set of opinions on the college campus?
With the two of you sitting there, I think we should not draw any conclusions.
Well,
I think that was some respect just thrown here.
At the danger of agreeing with something well, no, I'm not going to agree with them.
You know what I'm saying. I mean, you know what I'm saying.
I do, and I guess I would say that we agree that you sort of freedom of speech is a function of your perceived environment and who has power and things like that. And I think the data, at least on American college campus, would bear out that the silencing or self-silencing is disproportionately of conservatives. Now, you can flip that and say they shouldn't be such, you know what I mean.
Baby.
I don't know all these words these
snowflake
days,
come to mind? Yes.
But okay, so
No, and I will also add this. Anecdotally, I have a child on a college campus, and one might assume that it is very liberal. And yet she had a class last semester with a professor who talked openly about his faith in Jesus Christ and servant leadership. And she was surprised about that, given that it was a basic economics class. She also participates in a student organization which is rampantly right-wing. And as a young woman of color, she is amused by that. But it's, I think that assumption that college campuses are all liberal is dangerous. I really do.
Well, and again, all of us bring our life experience to this to a certain degree. So once again, the empirics are there. This is being studied. Iglesias at Vox is studying this. Heterodox Academy is studying this. So for those of you who wonder about the actual ideological breakdown and where the impacts of speech restrictions might be. The evidence is there. I would simply like to support the idea that colleges and universities should be particularly attuned to challenging the dominant government policies that are in place with any given administration. I think that is a critical role. You're going to have one political party that is establishing policy that's going to think that it has all the evidence that it needs to go forward with welfare reform or with military policy or whatever it's going to be. And it should be colleges and universities that say, you know what, we're not so sure, we want to dig into that, and we might want to challenge that. I think it's particularly important, and right now, if Republicans or whoever's in charge, honestly, I don't know who's in charge of the White House, but whatever that might be, I support that. It is in those cases where different student groups or different faculty want to support policies, when they receive pushback, when they are actually shut down in their efforts to try to communicate their particular ideas, that's where I oppose it. But the idea that there should be pushback, I am with you. I completely
Thank you,
agree.
Kurt.
Thank you both.
Mary, go ahead.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm a little bit confused about how we toggle back and forth between empiricism and psychology. So which is it? I mean, and I will say to the table to the left, your emphasis on psychology has surprised me, because it strikes me that many conservatives are worried that we are concerned about creating safe spaces and psychologically enclosed environments where we pay too much attention to the psychological space. With regard to Professor Walsh's commentary about the 60s, in the 60s, the feminists and the civil rights activists were shouted down, humiliated, and shamed profoundly. They didn't win necessarily in that moment. They won over time in the marketplace of ideas. So if the current individuals, who I agree with Professor Campbell, bad manners are being shown to them, and I don't hew to those manners. I don't think names should be called. I don't think people should be talked over. But if in the fullness of time those ideas win, then they win. And so I would ask you to respond to the fact that, is this a backlash to the fact that over the last 30 years, the feminists, the civil rights activists, and others won the argument of the day? They were shamed and humiliated in the 60s. They were shouted down. They were treated abhorrently. And I would argue that they were treated more abhorrently than current minority idea holders.
So
Thank you, Mary. And I'm going to interject just by saying I'm going to keep a tight leash on the time. No offense intended. Just
I have a very quick
That's fine.
10-second remark.
Please do.
but you
Please
go
do.
first.
all right, so I fully agree that freedom of speech is an achievement, that it was hard fought for, and in some ways is an ideal. What I worry about is the same thing we've seen with religious liberty, where we now see it in scare quotes. There are certain ideas that some speech is inherently harmful, things like that. But I worry about the scare quotification of free speech, right? Which is an idea that's spreading and becoming popular. And so I think it's an achievement. I think it's an achievement continually worth fighting for. And I'm all for encouraging people to exercise a little civic courage and say something unpopular. But remember, the first part of my argument was that people are increasingly willing on college campus to impose costs on people who express unpopular views. I do think there is a limit, especially with 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, to how much civic courage we demand of them in order for their education environment to be a good one.
Kurt, you had a short.
Very quickly. I appreciate that comment, because I believe the marketplace ideas, and if that means the other side wins, that's great. We're not talking about bad manners. Berkeley event canceled. This is in 2017. February 2017, the McGinnis event at NYU canceled. The Charles Murray event in March canceled. Amy Wax has been barred from teaching first-year students. Professor Josh Blackman's speech canceled. And then I find out the very next day, what are we, like 3 days down the road, alumni event at Duke Law School canceled. We're talking about shutting down free speech and not letting the market apply at all.
Well, that's not quite true. And indeed, it's only reasonable to mention, if you're going to mention Josh Blackman, you're going to mention Amy Wax.
Go for it.
Then at least mention what occurred. Josh Blackman's talk was not shut down or canceled. The topic for it was changed. And then he gave the speech because people didn't want to hear it. So that's one. Number two, if you're going to talk about Amy Wax, talk about what she said, which from what was reported, what she said was verifiably false, and it discussed the academic standing of African American students at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and the claim that black students don't end up in the top half of the class, and that was simply not true. So yes, you've been banned from teaching first-year law students when you tell tales about them, particularly when it goes to African Americans, and it's not true. So yeah, sorry that there are some actual responses that come when you say things that aren't true. That's not about free speech.
Josh Blackman's speech was canceled. It never took place. There was a change in topic. He then went to the new topic. He never gave the speech. Go to the tape.
Let's have
if there are
another question.
if there are reasons to kill speech, then go ahead and do it, but at least acknowledge what you're doing.
All right.
Kurt,
Another question.
Kurt, well, hold on a second. Kurt, that's just not true. The speech did not occur. Unless we're talking about two different speeches, it didn't not occur. You can go to the tape. So we'll just go ahead and leave it at that.
There you go.
All right. Next question, please. Thank you.
So this is for both sides. Neither side distinguished or determined between the difference between a private education and a public education. So shouldn't public schools be held to the same policy standards as the government when it comes to free speech on campuses, whereas private schools have their own policies for it?
You might want to have different policies. So, for example, you might want to forbid resurrection deniers at your particular private university. It really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But yes, they already are, right? Under our law, the public universities are they are arms of the government. They're subject to the same rules. In some ways, that can be exploited by trolls and others. But I'm not sure that you want to have uniform rules or that it's the same necessarily. The rules we apply against the government, we apply against the dean, of a particular university. So there's tons of distinctions we can draw. So thank you.
I'm going to move things along. Ariana, go ahead.
Hello. So I know Professor Chambers kind of touched on this a bit earlier in the talk, and this is another one for anybody to touch upon. But what I wanted to ask is, in the second clip that was showed in the video, we saw protesters going toward, showing up at a talk, and pretty much kind of shouting it down. I'm not sure, I think it was canceled, I can't remember. But so my question was, what responsibility or maybe obligation, I'm not sure, do colleges have when it comes to talks that are, or speeches or debates or whatever that happen, and students who do have the right to protest, but they come and they try and shut down that talk? Like, how do you balance the rights to hear the speech and the rights to protest?
Well, my response would be that the university has an obligation to protect the integrity of the events, and that they ought to call the campus police if they're unable to continue with the event. Like I said, I think that speakers being shouted down, if you want to engage in that form of civil disobedience, just like breaking windows in a shop or something like that, you pay the consequences. And they ought to pay the consequences. Now, that is not the same thing as saying that as a matter of morality or as a matter of the university's educational mission, that all of these speakers should have been invited in the first place. I think that there has been a tendency of late to invite people to campus who are just trolls, who are just trying to incite exactly this response rather than trying to genuinely debate, genuinely advance ideas and so forth. And I think that's very regrettable because, in part, it just fuels the narrative, and the narrative itself is destructive. The narrative itself contributes to a sense of isolation of certain views. It leads to the increase in trollism itself. And so you just see a proliferation of exactly this in response to the narrative, which I think is very regrettable.
Well, it's either true or false, right? It might be destructive and it might be unpleasant. But in response to the question of what should administrators do, So suppose you're the dean of the CUNY Law School where Josh was speaking, and essentially he came in and you saw the chanting and all that. And then when he went in, first of all, it was mostly empty room, probably because people just didn't want to bother dealing with that. And then they stood behind him with signs. When he tried to speak, they spoke over him. This went on for about 8 minutes. Then an authority figure came in and eventually said, "You got to go," and eventually they left. And so there was then an interchange. I would say it was successfully disrupted. But what should the administrator do there? There should be consequences for disruption. And instead, what the administrator announced is there was only, by time, about 11% of the time, and so that was respectful, and there was no violence, and so it's okay. So those students, what's the lesson that they learned from that? It's not the one that the dean was sending.
Let's take another question, and we only have a couple more minutes left, so go ahead, thanks.
Sure. My question is for Professor Campbell and Professor Chambers. So you've talked a little bit about the need for universities to regulate conversations that are going on campus. And so my question would be, you've sort of got the Holocaust situation on one hand, which is a historical event. Okay, this happened, it didn't happen, and we've got a lot of evidence on that. But a lot of these debates that are going on are very fundamental questions about us as human beings. Who are we? What's our relation to one another? What's our purpose? And so if we're going to regulate these discussions on college campuses, what's the point of reference from which it would be appropriate to do that?
Yeah, let's step back for just 1 second. We're not talking about regulating conversations. We're saying is that there are certain things that will advance the university's mission, and those things should be appreciated and should be pushed. The things that will not advance the university's mission of trying to discover truth and advance knowledge, those things should be pulled back. So there are an awful lot of areas where, hey, dispute, you had me in class. I'm all about dispute in terms of talking and getting to a place where we can get to a higher level of knowledge. And I can take a bunch of wacky views and sort of put them together if they've got some kernel to them. But what we're talking about, generally speaking, is let's make sure that the university is a place for doing that and not just a place where we have folks who show up just to make other people upset with no way of going to higher knowledge.
And I do think the question is important and challenging, and partly what makes this so difficult is that we're in a moment of high political tension and cultural transition. So one thing that would be very easy to put on the Holocaust denial side of the ledger is white supremacy. Is the same thing true of people who take certain moral attitudes about homosexuality? A lot of people would say yes, because they see that as an equivalent position. And yet we know that the prevalence of views with respect to sex and sexual activity are lagging in some respects behind changes that have already occurred, at least within elite society, with respect to race. And so how we mediate that sort of cultural transition, I think, is very difficult. That goes to exactly whose views matter, how it is that we tolerate difference. And I think what we should be doing is having a relatively liberal attitude about that up to a point. And that's the conversation we have to have. My bigger point is the people who have those conversations in good faith and decide that as a matter of our community, we don't want someone here who is saying bigoted things about people who are from sexual minorities, that is also free speech, right? We have a different definition, a different answer to your question, but the fact that we have genuinely approached your question and tried to come to grips with answering it and have come to different conclusions, it doesn't mean one side is pro-free speech and the other side is anti-free speech. It just means we have different responses to the pivotal questions.
All right, we actually don't have time for another question, but I'm going to have you ask it, and because we want to hear from students, you all may respond by folding in your final statements, your concluding remarks as well. So you can agree and amplify the great point, you can disagree and make your concluding remarks that way. I'm sorry to the others who couldn't ask a question.
This actually goes well with the last question. So, but earlier, I can't remember who said it, either Walsh or Lash, you were disputing what Professor Chambers said about campus's ability to pull back falsehoods and to pull back things that have already been established. So if that's not feasible or not able to be implemented, how can we implement things that control internal silencing factors? How is that more feasible than what Professor Chambers stated? Thank you.
And now we give our final.
Go ahead, Kurt. Start.
Final thing. Thank you for that question, because I think ultimately the only way that can occur is by having a diverse community of students and faculty that you've built to begin with. 150 years ago, the people added an amendment protecting the privileges or immunities of American citizenship and demanding that state officials equally protect the rights of all persons. Unfortunately, at that time, government officials failed to adequately protect those equal rights, and the voices calling for greater freedom were left unprotected in the face of police batons and private violence. It was not until the 20th century that courts in the country finally awoke to the need to equally protect everyone's right to free expression, an ideal just as important to minorities as it is to majorities in society as a whole. As Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote just last year, a law that can be directed against speech found offensive to some portion of the public can be turned against minority and dissenting views to the detriment of all. Our reliance must be on the substantial safeguards of free and open discussion in a democratic society. Today, on college campuses around the country, we are experiencing an increase in canceled events, an increase in disrupted speeches, an increase in student self-censorship. The ideal of robust and uninhibited expression is suffering, and suffering, I believe, from a deadly disease. My partner and I believe that it's not dead on college campuses, but we only seek to convince you that treatment is needed.
Thank you. Judd, do you have any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I think it's important to emphasize that universities have a special role. So universities are not just regulators of private conduct in the same way the government is. Universities have different capacities that they're acting in. They're educating in classrooms. They're forms of association that themselves come with certain rights. And so when we limit who it is that we have on campus, have debates about whose voices matter, have debates about what values we as a society, as a campus organization, as a broader campus society want to prioritize, when we have those sorts of debates and come to decisions about them, we are furthering the goal of free speech. We are having conversations and deciding who we are, what sort of values are advanced by certain types of student activities. That is exactly the conversation we want. We do not want this debate to be shaped by the sort of institutional agnosticism that the Supreme Court has advocated in its decisions simply because of concerns that aren't present in the campus context.
Thank you, Judd. Kevin.
The last question was, what can we do about silencing? And I think the first thing to do is recognize that it's happening. So we've said the empirics are out there. So what percentage, would be okay of college students saying, I feel like I can't express my views, right? I don't do it. What percentage is going to be okay? What percentage differential would be okay if we said, on your campus, are liberal students free to express their views and are conservative students free to express their views? What percentage would be okay for college students to say it's sometimes acceptable to shout down speakers? Okay, so going beyond the just enforce the rules. Well, here are the percentages, okay? And this is Gallup, Knight Foundation. Are you free to express your views on campus if you're a political conservative? 69% said yes, so that's pretty good, I suppose. What about political liberals? 92%. And this is the same set of respondents, right? So the political liberals realize that some people are self-censoring. 2016, 54% of college students perceive their campus environment prevents people from saying things. That increased by 7% to 61% in 2017. In 2017, 37% of those surveyed said it was sometimes acceptable to shout down speakers. Thankfully, only 10% said it's okay to engage in violence. I guess they're not here. When you have categories of inherently hurtful, hateful speech, people will self-center, and we just will describe things as microaggressions and other things, and it will deter from free exchange of ideas. I'm done.
Thank you, Kevin. Hank, some final remarks, please.
Thank you all so much for participating in this civil discourse. It's been a great discussion about free speech, so clearly you should vote no on the resolution. Campuses that pride themselves on being free speech zones are primarily sloganeering. My classroom is not a free speech zone, and it should not be. My classroom is a place where learning should occur. I provide space for students to speak freely about issues and in ways that move us forward vis-a-vis the pedagogical goals I have for the class. That does not make my class a free speech zone. Free speech or open speech is not the value. Rather, it is the means to serve the underlying purpose of educating students in the larger goal of uncovering and creating knowledge and truth. Certainly there may be places on a campus where speech is freer than in others, but a campus speaker creates an atmosphere more akin to a classroom than the quad. I'd like to think that universities share the common goal of discovering and producing truth. Debunking already falsified claims wastes the university's most precious resources, the intellectual capacity and time of its constituents. The university's resources should be used on issues that can be reasonably and honestly debated, or on topics on which a speaker can shed new or different light. This is not about liberal orthodoxy, it's about the university's mission. Certain campus speakers may draw protests and may draw people who go overboard and cross the line. We don't condone that, and we don't condone shouting down speakers, but I have not seen a significant increase in activity that stops speakers from speaking on campus. There is no epidemic of speakers being shouted down, even if more speakers are being shouted at. Those who suggest that free speech is being stopped on American campuses may want to consider whether what they really want is for the protesters to simply stop using their speech to challenge speakers who they believe provide little value to the academic discourse. Given that, I hope you vote no on the resolution.
Thank you very much, Hank. All right, everybody, it's time to vote and see who moved the needle, if at all. So pull out your phones again, and I think Carl is going to put up on the screen exactly what you need to be able to vote. Is Carl here? There he is.
Are you allowed to be undecided still?
Yeah, if you're still undecided.
Yes.
As long as not everyone gets
Yeah. Can everyone see what it takes to vote from where you are? Should I read it out to help? If you did not vote first, either because you came late, because you don't know how to work a phone, something like that, don't vote this time. It'll skew the results. I'm sure some of these people have tried to get their family members to skew the results, but don't do it. We're up to 53 results. Last time we had 57, I believe, at the end. 58 we had. We're at 56, 57, almost 58 there, maybe. There's 58.
We're going to lock it now since it's at the same number. So 58. No movement.
All right, sounds great. So the reveal.
If you'll give us several moments.
Oh, several moments. Yes, absolutely. They have to tabulate the results in a second. Yeah, we could talk about the reception. We can also, I'll tell you what.
Let's make predictions.
Oh, predictions?
No.
Oh, well, of course we can thank the panelists. They were fairly well behaved. Look at this. I can't believe this. Oh my gosh. Professor Walsh is tearing up. He's tearing up. My goodness. That's amazing. It's amazing. Well, I will confess, before this event, I went to University of Richmond Student Handbook to try to figure out what rules and regulations we have. And there's actually not very many. There are some, I don't want to say vague, that sounds pejorative, but there are some vague terms that says we ought to be, roughly speaking, respectful and nice to each other. That are not applied in the sense that you are forbidden from saying anything controversial. But there are rules couched in various places in the handbook that suggest we must be respectful of each other. Beyond that, there's not, when I said speech codes, I know some campuses have wrestled with this, but beyond that, most campuses have not. I would say the one big place in which speech is much more highly regulated than in what you might call generic political speech is anything involving sexual misconduct. and anything involving fraternities and sororities, particularly hazing. So if you go through the student handbook, you can see things that you're not allowed to do as part of a hazing ritual, but as far as I can tell, you're allowed to do it otherwise. So I wouldn't say allowed to do it, but it apparently falls outside the purview. You know, I think I'll tell you, yeah, so the question for Professor Chambers is, have I noticed a change in classroom discussion? And I'll tell you what, I have noticed a change, but it might be because I've initiated a change, my own change in how I approach particular issues. And it partly is personality. That's what comes to mind, and I don't mean to take the floor beyond just saying this much. Sometimes when you hear speakers like this, your reaction to it depends on your own personality. Sometimes it's just offensive to be in the room with someone who you feel has such nasty views. Other people are like, let's rumble. This is fun. This is exciting. I'm much less of a let's rumble type of person. I don't like a classroom that's a let's rumble. I want to get along, so I tend not to create as much controversy with my own statements. And I think that's actually perfectly fine. Kurt Lash's point is well taken. It takes all types in classrooms. So in my classroom, we tend to have very nice, calm, jokey conversations, but we don't tackle some of the hardest issues in an explicit way. And I think other classes do. Any other comments from you guys' own teaching?
This isn't exactly responsive. I've just started teaching here at the University of Richmond. I just want to comment on the extraordinary diversity of opinion that I've found in my classes, and my students know of what I speak. Just this last week, teaching the VMI case and getting conversations both in class and outside of class in terms of people who have military experience, who bring insight to bear that I did not have and that I learned from. It's been a wonderful experience so far, and again, it comes from that diversity of background and diversity of ideas. It's been very nice.
I think there's some interpretation of results that's going on, which may suggest it might be close. But I am curious. I don't want to put you on the spot, Wendy, but I'm going to put you on the spot. If students did show up and start to heckle someone who a student group had invited in, I won't ask what you would do, but hypothetically, what might you do?
We can find out, right? We'll get some Federalist Society folks, some of the...
Yeah, well, what happens if the dean heckles the speakers here? Like Professor Campbell, I think disruption is not appropriate. And so I would take the steps to bring the disruption to an end. What does that take? Well, it depends on what the situation looks like. So we can't have violence, we can't have disruption. So we attempt to stop that in some nonviolent but appropriate means.
Heckle the hecklers.
Well, one of the reasons sometimes we have speakers in our classroom, and one of the things we want is for those speakers to feel good about coming back, right? So I would never prime my students with questions, and I think our students here are incredibly respectful and understand if you've got a guest, then you treat the guest like a guest.
I think that's right.
So it's kind of an interesting question. I can't even imagine it happening here where students would engage in bad behavior, but it would be kind of interesting if we were at a school where sometimes some bad behavior might well occur.
And there's a range of bad behavior. I've been at events where it was the protest was a group of students silently turning their back on the speaker. Didn't prevent them from speaking, but registered a disagreement. That strikes me. That's a different matter than disruption.
Wendy, I'll take the mic from you. We have the results. So the big reveal comes right now. It turns out that Professors Campbell and Chambers moved the needle in their direction. So when we started, 47% thought that campus free speech was in decline, and after the debate, only 40% thought it was in decline. To state it in the opposite way, when we started, 43% were not very worried about campus free speech, and now a greater number, 55%, are not very worried. So the undecided went down by 5%, but even if you collected all the undecideds, you definitely had to change some people's minds. And so there we go. A debate, still fairly close, which is a sign that it was a good issue, so we'll leave it at that. We have a reception outside. You guys can pose more questions to the panelists out there. Thank you to the panelists and for everyone, and for Emily for attending. Thank you.
I did my best.